much. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Hamidreza Azizi, for joining us. Today, we are going to talk about Iran and war in Gaza. The Iranian response on the Gaza crisis will be the main discussion of on what Dr. Hamidreza Azizi is going to speak for us today. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Hamidreza Azizi. Dr. Hamidreza Azizi is a visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, in Berlin. And he is also a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Doha, Qatar. Dr. Azizi holds a PhD in regional studies from the University of Tehran, and he has also worked as a lecturer in the University of Tehran and several other Iranian universities. Dr. Hamidreza has so many articles, research papers. He has been working and studying Iranian affairs very closely, and he has been specializing on Iranian affairs and Iranian strategic affairs for a very long time. And today we are going to talk about how Iranians have rather won the public opinion, or they have got much support, or what exactly is happening, because this time we are not seeing much difference between Saudi Arabia and UAE and Iran. So Iran does not have much opportunity to say that Saudis or the Emiratis or other Arab countries are really betraying the Palestinian cause, as they have been saying in the past. So in this way, the Iranian reaction this time was supposed to be different, more calculated, and specific to certain objectives. So on all these issues, we are going to hear from Dr. Hamidreza Azizi, who has been an expert, who has been contributing for international journals and international think tanks. And I'm really thankful for his time and his acceptance of our invitation. And because we are going through Ramadan, and a lot of people who are fasting, they might not have joined us today, but for sure we are going to relay this video again, and we hope that his discussion is going to contribute in understanding of this issue. So thank you very much, Dr. Azizi, Dr. Hamidreza Azizi again, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Many thanks to the Center for India and West Asia Studies for having me, for inviting me, and especially to my dear friend, Dr. Anas, for hosting this conversation. So first of all, excuse me if my voice is not quite clear. I caught a cold last week, and it's still impacting, one way or another. There's, of course, a lot to discuss when it comes to Iran's positioning in the war in Gaza. But let me start by saying that actually the Iranian reaction to the war so far has been quite in line with the kind of pattern of behavior that we know beforehand. I mean, in terms of Iran's positioning vis-a-vis different wars, especially those concerning its or involving, better to say, of its allies. If we go back and look at what Iran did and how Iran reacted to the war, 2006 war in Lebanon between Hezbollah and Israel, or the Iranian reactions to the previous rounds of conflicts in Gaza, like in 2014, that was quite clear that, as a rule, Iran has always tried to stay away from directly engaging in the conflict, knowing its sort of limitations when it comes to conventional military capabilities. And by the way, this is the main foundation for Iran's defense strategy, based on forward defense and asymmetric deterrence. I will get into details of that a bit later, but just to say that, the overall pattern was more or less in line with what many experts would predict or would expect. But of course, there has been, of course, especially as the war gets protracted somehow, and the longer it takes, basically, more risks and to some extent opportunities that Iran sees coming out of this conflict. So I will try to present an outline basically of Iran's position, its calculation, and as indicated in the title of this panel, miscalculations vis-a-vis the war in Gaza, and then I will be happy to answer any questions or to focus on any specific aspects that might be kind of more sort of important to the audience. So Iran's first reaction, of course, I mean, basically, I think somebody's mic is on. Since day one of the conflict, basically, Iran's official position toward the war in Gaza has had basically two aspects. So it's actually two main elements we can identify in Iran's approach. On one hand, Iran clearly supports what they call as Palestinian resistance, including the Hamas attack on October 7 against Israel, basically attributing the attack itself, this specific moment, not to sort of an act of aggression or whatever it is called, usually, but to sort of accumulation of the resentment and suppression, etc., on the Palestinian side that was sort of manifested in the October 7 attack. So basically, they are quite clear in supporting what Hamas did and what Hamas is doing in fighting against Israel in Gaza and elsewhere. At the same time, and maybe this is something that some people would expect to unfold otherwise, Iran makes sure, I mean, they make every effort to make sure that nobody is going to blame them for having a direct role in the attack or being directly involved in the war. So if we take, for example, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei's words on this, in his first reaction, a couple of days after the attacks, basically, he praised what he called the courageous Palestinian youth for the attack on October 7. While at the same time, he made it clear that, in his own words, whoever thinks that this wasn't a Palestinian work is basically, making a mistake. So they try to, as I said, emphasize that Iran had no role in planning and conducting the attack. Actually, this is something that different media and later intelligence reports have also indicated. For example, the latest and maybe the most important one being the annual report of the US intelligence community, basically mentioning that Iran had no role and actually was caught by surprise by what Hamas did. So that is, I mean, this element of surprise and the apparent uncoordinated sort of operation or attack by Hamas partly explain Iran's response, because, of course, Iran has been working to develop this whole network of non-state allies and proxies that it calls axis of resistance. Iran has been supporting, as Dr. Anas mentioned earlier, has been supporting different militias and political factions in Palestine, in Lebanon, like Hamas, like Islamic Jihad, like Hezbollah. And the type of support has been comprehensive, of course, spanning from military support to financially backing them, all these kinds of things. But at the same time, the main logic behind building this network has been to use it as one of the elements of that so-called asymmetric deterrence that I mentioned earlier. So this has to do with the fact that, especially as a consequence of 8 years of war with Iraq in the 1980s, Iran started to realize, and then, of course, the international sanctions, arms embargoes, etc. Iran started to realize that its comparative kind of capabilities in terms of military power, when it comes to, compared with regional rivals like the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf, like Israel, etc. And also, of course, we have direct US presence in the region. So in that sense, Iran started to realize that its conventional military capabilities cannot kind of account for a sort of reliable defense or deterrence. And at the same time, they cannot upgrade their the main elements of their conventional military, like especially air power. So they started working on other elements. So other elements, one is missile program, for example, later drone program and cyber. But almost at the same time they started working on missiles, they also started on working on this network of axis of resistance. And we need to also take into account that all these elements are quite interconnected. When we speak about the axis of resistance, for example, this is not a kind of this doesn't come in abstract. Iran uses those other elements like missiles, like drones, to support these groups. But the overall function of all these, including again this network, is to provide deterrence for Iran, is to come to Iran's defense or come to Iran's aid whenever a serious threat comes or a war happens, something like that, and not the opposite. So this is very important to take into account. So in that sense, Hamas entering into basically Israel going forward with its plans to crush Hamas, and the war between Hamas and Israel, even theoretically, even conceptually, wouldn't involve Iranian direct involvement. If it was the opposite, it was the other way around. If there was a war between Israel, then those arms, those regional arms, including Hamas and Hezbollah, others, had to be or were supposed to be activated. This is the first thing. Second, and back to the element of surprise. So one of the foundations of this whole network is coordination. So coordination has gone through sort of a developmental process itself, because when former Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani was still there, the axis of resistance had a different structure. It was a sort of hierarchical network, Soleimani himself and the Quds Force on top. And then we had field commanders in different countries, like Abu Mati al-Muhandis in Iraq, like Hassan Nasrallah himself in Lebanon, in charge of basically local coordination. But it was like, everything would, go back to the top and be decided by Soleimani and the Quds Force. But after his death, and because basically, on the one hand, Iran had no single person who would, basically fit in his shoes in terms of his charisma, in terms of his kind of personal connections, all these sort of things. And on the other hand, in order to prevent the risk of, sort of the whole network being in danger when the top man is targeted, like what happened to Soleimani, they started restructuring. And restructuring happened in a way that I have called it in an article as decentralization. Decentralization means that, and this became clear in this war in Gaza. Decentralization means that we have something called a joint operations room, or what is officially called in Iran as the integrated network of command and control, in which different groups, like all of these militias, for example, and the Quds Force have representatives, and there's going to be some sort of a consensual decision-making, coming out of this structure. Of course, Iran itself and Hezbollah especially has some sort of veto power, has the upper hand in the structure, but it's more consensual. But what I'm going to say, I describe all this just to say that, this is based on coordination. And then it is also going to serve the interests of all different members of the network. But and if we assume that those reports of Hamas doing something uncoordinated are correct, then it was against the foundations of this whole network. So the logic of alliance, the logic of resistance that they have promoting requires them, including Iran, to support Hamas in this fight. But because they were basically caught by surprise, as I said, and basically unprepared, they wouldn't, go one step further. So that element of surprise also means that as a result of the October 7 attack and then the Israeli response, which also brought the United States in, and this was something that maybe decision makers in Iran and in some other allied countries like in Lebanon wouldn't expect. As a result of that, the whole network went on defensive and went on deterrence mode rather than offensive. So whatever we see, whatever we have seen actually in the past 4 or 5 months from Hezbollah's incremental escalation against Israel to the Houthis basically targeting international shipping in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandab, to the Iraqi militias basically targeting the US interest. This is basically, this may seem as a proactive approach. This may seem as a part of an overall strategy, with October 7 attack being one element of that, and then these basically moves complementing that. But it's not like that. That's not the mentality in these countries. The mentality is to prevent the expansion of the conflict, to prevent the more active involvement of those other actors, especially the United States, in order to save Hamas, and by extension, to save the whole network. So that's why I'm saying that in their own mentality, regardless of the very fact that those acts are, of course, offensive, but the logic behind that is based on deterring the United States from entering into a war, deterring Israel and the US to respond directly to Iran, as I said, which is also the logic of the whole network, and as I said, to save Hamas and the whole axis. So this was basically the first part of what I wanted to say in terms of, to answer the question of why Iran did not show sort of stronger response or more direct response or something like that. So this is actually the operational or sort of strategic calculation behind that. But there's another calculation which is more or less diplomatic, and that has to do with the perceived, I would say, the perceived diplomatic achievements that Iran, kind of sees or expects as a result of the October 7 attack. First of all, and the most important one, just going back a few days before October 7, Ayatollah Khamenei made a speech in which he warned the Arab states normalizing with Israel, and in this case specifically Saudi Arabia, of course, without naming it, of betting on a losing horse. And so that was his warning. And a few days later, the October 7 attack happened. So, of course, the unexpected and uncoordinated element of that attack aside, but the thing is that the attack itself and the blow that it caused to Israel's, first of all, reputation as an undefeatable army, and second, the impact that it immediately started to have, especially after Israel started its response in the Arab and Islamic world, that was like a gift to Iran. And Iran started building on that to first, basically two things which are quite related. First, to prevent, especially Saudi Arabia and other countries, to go ahead with normalization with Israel anytime in the short term, in the near future, and at the same time to develop its own process of rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, which had started only a few months earlier in March, exactly last year. So Iran was quick. The Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Abdullahian started touring the region, from those countries hosting axis of resistance members like Qatar, Lebanon, etc., to Saudi Arabia, speaking even with, we've seen some very unexpected high-level meetings actually between Iranian and Arab officials, like when Raisi went to the first extraordinary meeting of the Islamic Cooperation Conference and met with not only Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, but also Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt, having in mind that these two countries don't have diplomatic relations for a long time. These were basically a breakthrough, or at least, as I said, it was perceived as such by Iran. And at the same time, various officials like Ayatollah Khamenei in his capacity as the leader of the country in all of his speeches, and at the same time Amir Abdullahian as the foreign minister of the country in his diplomatic capacity in Geneva, in other international settings, they have been calling on Muslim countries to boycott Israel, to cut their relations, etc. So these are basically the two elements that I've been mentioning. So that's another reason actually why Iran didn't didn't decide basically to go for a kind of more expansive, or better to say more direct intervention in the war, because what they hope to achieve strategically, they think they have already achieved. The normalization process between Saudi Arabia and Israel is already on halt, if not entirely stopped, and they are going ahead with their own plans. The Islamic countries, the sentiments, the public opinion in those countries have become very supportive of Palestine, etc. So this is the second element, diplomatic element. And the third element, which is basic, or the third aspect, which also factors into Iran's calculations, is again, despite the fact that the Hamas attack was uncoordinated and all these actors seem to have been caught by surprise, they did well actually in coming to Hamas's aid. So the Iraqi, the division of labor basically that we have seen in this network, in the axis of resistance, like Iraqi militias being in charge of making trouble for the United States, then the Houthis basically literally globalizing the war in Gaza by disrupting international shipping. So the way they responded, the way that they made an uncoordinated attack an opportunity to show coordination among themselves and unity and strength of the axis, that was also another factor which was seen as a big achievement in Iran. So again, looking at it from the perspective of the Iranian officials, the axis is actually doing well. The axis is doing well in, and just a couple of days ago, Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, basically, because when you want to understand the logic of the axis, it is as important to follow Hassan Nasrallah as to follow the Iranian officials. So he basically pointed to two factors when how to say, assessing the situation currently in Gaza. On one hand, he said Israel wanted to crush Hamas, to wipe out Hamas, and now after 5 months, they are negotiating with Hamas to end the war. So this is victory. And then he also said, even if Israel, implements its plans for ground invasion against Rafah in southern Gaza, even that will not change the equation, and the resistance has already won. So what that means is that on one hand, in the eyes of the leaders of the Islamic Republic and its allies, like in Lebanon, they have already won, despite the sort of damages to Hamas's military infrastructure, capabilities, etc. And at the same time, when he says even invading Rafah is not going to change anything, it means that this level of engagement that we have seen is going to remain. Even in that case, Iran is not going to intervene. So that's the sort of messaging that is going on. So these are about the calculations that Iran has, and it sees basically itself in a kind of comfortable place. But I will conclude with this part. But when you look at how the actual situation has evolved on the ground, there are also important risks that I would attribute to, some of them to miscalculation, some of them to, of course, unintended outcomes of Iran's activities. So first of all, starting with what Iran perceives as the biggest sort of, in their eye, positive consequence of October 7, the halt, better to say, in the normalization process between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So that has happened, of course. And especially as long as the war is going on, nobody expects Saudi Arabia to go ahead and normalize relations with Israel. But the thing is that the normalization is not off the table. And the way that the Saudis are approaching it, it seems as if they want to turn it into a leverage to impact the negotiating process between Hamas and basically between the Palestinian side and Israel, to use it as a leverage for, and this is of course something that the United States also wants, and they share this objective. They want to turn it into leverage also to convince Israel to agree to the two-state solution, or at least a path toward the two-state solution. This is another thing. And of course, if everything goes as planned, then to enhance Saudi Arabia's diplomatic position in the region. None of these are something that would be kind of beneficial for Iran's longer-term strategic interests, because and I would say, and I have heard this from other experts working on the other side of the Gulf as well, that actually, as a result of October 7, as a result of all these activities by Iran-backed groups around the region, the Saudis' willingness, basically, the desire on the Saudi side to go ahead with normalization might have actually increased, not decreased, because they see how formidable and how troublesome the Iran-backed axis can be and is. And that means for longer term, I mean, now, of course, the situation is kind of good, friendly, not friendly, of course. They are in good terms, at least Iran and Arab countries, partly also because of the war in Gaza, as I mentioned. But who knows what's going to come in the future? And in an event of a confrontation between those same Arab countries and Iran, this network has shown its abilities to create big problems. And this is what would logically prompt them to go ahead and form a kind of counterbalancing bloc with Israel. And now they are quite cautious. There were reports that United Arab Emirates, for example, and some other countries, they didn't even allow the United States to use their bases, the US bases in those countries actually to conduct attacks against Iran-backed militias in Iraq and elsewhere. But again, in the longer term perspective, I think they are more alarmed than before October 7. This is part of the miscalculation. If Iran thinks that, this is going to result in a total and eventual stop of the normalization process. This is first. Second, regardless of the level of coordination in the axis, a very important arm of the axis of resistance, which is the Palestinian groups, and especially Hamas, has substantially and fundamentally weakened. And this is going to remain, and it's going to take a long time, if at all, for them to repair. And that means a very important leg of Iran's deterrence from within the Palestinian territories, right under the nose of Israel, is no longer there, or is no longer as capable as it used to be. And at the same time, Israel's fears of an eventual multi-front war is already, that's a scenario that Israel was always concerned about, a multi-front war, different Iranian sort of allies getting involved in a war from the Houthis, Hezbollah, etc. That has already happened, and Israel is still there. So in the next confrontation, Israel may have less reservations in targeting Iran, in going for a more offensive approach. So again, thinking longer term, this is not quite in line with what Iran expects to achieve. And so these are basically the main elements. And finally, when it comes to Iran's diplomatic position, of course, as I said, the war has provided an opportunity for Iran to reach out to those Arab countries, but at the same time, some of the reactions that Iran has shown has actually deteriorated, again, the longer-term perspective of its relations, like the missile attacks against Erbil in Iraq and against Pakistan. So the logic behind those attacks, of course, was that, Iran started to see some of the implications, repercussions of the war in Gaza, in the sense that Israel's campaign of targeted assassinations basically went into a new level, targeting high-ranking Iranian officers in Syria, etc. While before, Israel would basically try not to kill the people. They would try to disrupt the transfer and logistical lines, but they wouldn't kill Iranians. This has changed. So as a result of that, Iran wanted to show response. And at the same time, when all different elements of the axis of resistance were already involved, Iran might have felt that it couldn't just sit idly by, and there was a need for a symbolic response. But the response backfired, in the sense that they fired missiles at Pakistan. Pakistan hit back, and the whole image of effective deterrence that Iran wanted to depict was gone. That is the first thing. And then, of course, in the case of Iraq, Iran's breach of Iraqi sovereignty, without actually providing any concrete evidence that what they call the Mossad headquarters in Erbil was actually a Mossad headquarters in Erbil. That also started to impact the Iraqi public opinion against Iran. So these are the challenges. Of course, there are other elements, but these are the main ones. I will stop here. I'm sorry for taking long time, but I just wanted to just address different aspects of the issue.
Thank you very much. A wonderful discussion indeed. I think that we will have some question and answer, and I will request my friends who are attending the event, if they have any question, please raise your hands so that I can give the opportunity one by one. I will wait for your hands to be raised. Meanwhile, I would like to, I have some questions, specifically after the massive reaction which Israelis have done against Hamas this time. And we can conclude that Israelis did not care about any humanitarian aspect, any international law, any diplomatic pressure, and they didn't even make any excuse of killing the Palestinians brutally in the most brutal manner, whatever they could have done, and they have killed so far more than 30,000 people. And it appears that the Hamas adventure in Gaza, now it has been criticized by many Arabs as well. And in such a situation, and many, I have heard many Arabs, they are calling Hamas operation as misadventure rather, because this adventure or this operation of Hamas, Tufan Aqsa, was certainly different from previous operations which used to be calculated and they had certain objectives to achieve. But this time, going inside the Israeli cities and capturing so many civilians, was considered as rather quite different model of violence by Hamas standard itself. So the reaction has come as expected. Now, my understanding is that there is a possibility that Hamas lose the control of Gaza. It will remain as a militant organization, but it may lose the ruling status of Hamas of Gaza. There is one understanding, and second is that Iranian support to Hamas, I mean, in my understanding, is becoming more untenable and less sustainable. So, how do you see Iran's support for Hamas in coming months, especially after the war? Whether it will remain the same, and how the Iranian support to Palestinian groups will be. One more question, if I can add, is, as you said, that there was a normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Don't they have any understanding or mutual understanding on Palestinian issue? How this normalization has happened without having a discussion, for example, about Palestine and Syria? There are certain issues about Iraq, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine where things are happening with the involvement of Iran. And Saudi intelligence must have spoken about these issues as well. So it seems that, as you said, that Iranians wanted to halt or discourage Saudis from having normalization, and they have temporarily achieved the objective. However, what I want to understand, whether the Saudis and Iranians, when they had the normalization talk in Beijing, didn't they talk about the Palestinian issue and its future? Yeah, only these two observations.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the questions. Starting from the the last one, actually. I think, I mean, I can frame it like this. Actually, one of the incentives on the Iranian side to go for rapprochement with Saudi Arabia was to sort of, how to say, create a shield against the potential negative repercussions of an eventual Saudi-Israeli normalization. So as far as Iran is concerned, actually, they had already accepted, not accepted in the sense that, as a legitimate move, but as a fact, they had accepted the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel as eventually come. And putting it in the bigger picture of Iran's kind of regional threat perception and regional strategy, they would see it as sort of maybe the last piece of the puzzle of Israel basically encircling Iran strategically, because since 2020, basically speaking of last year when the agreement was concluded between Iran and Saudi Arabia, since 2020, in just 3 years, the whole geopolitical landscape around Iran's neighborhood had changed. On one hand, we had the war in Karabakh, and as a consequence of that, the further warming up of relations between Azerbaijan and Israel, which Iran sees with a great deal of concern, and also Israel also reaching out to Central Asian countries, basically expanding its influence all over Iran's northern neighborhood. At the same time, toward the south, we had Abraham Accords in the same year, starting with UAE and Bahrain, and then more recently there were talks about the potential formation of a military coalition, defensive coalition as they called it, but Iran would see it, of course, as an offensive one. And there's another element to that, of course, that Saudi Arabia being basically or being perceived as the leader of the Muslim world, or at least the Sunni world, that would, its normalization would have a domino effect, bringing in other countries. So it was what I call as, on the Iranian side, rapprochement as deterrence, I would say. Going for rapprochement, going for détente with Saudi Arabia to use it as a deterrence and to get some assurances. There were economic elements also to the agreement, etc. But this is what concerns Saudi Arabia and Israel. And on the other hand, the most pressing issue basically that they were trying to deal with, and we know that Saudi Arabia started with broader demands like Iran reconsidering its intervention, its involvement in countries like Syria, Iraq, etc. But then, it all started to narrow down to a specific event, which was Yemen. And even on the case of Yemen, Iran didn't and could not, of course, because of the type of the relationship that they have with the Houthis. They support them, but they are not Iran's proxies. So even in that case, Iran couldn't give guarantees. But the guarantee came in the sense that, it facilitated dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Houthis themselves. So what I'm trying to say is that, first of all, the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian-Israel issue basically was not on the agenda in the sense that happened to the Palestinians. And on the other hand, so because there were other topics, more pressing topics like Yemen, and on the other hand, what was important for Iran was its own security against Israel. And at that time, not necessarily the Palestinian issue. And add to that the element of surprise that we discussed before. So that's how I can frame it in the case of Iran-Saudi, why it didn't come up in the Iran-Saudi agreements. About Iran's support for Hamas, how it's going to be, it is kind of related maybe to your first question, Hamas's control over Gaza. I see basically no scenario in which Hamas can maintain control as basically the ruler of Gaza. And this has become a non-starter for any single Israeli politician or political party is now opposed to that. And also the international community, because of the October 7, because of the sort of, attacks against civilians, things like that. So that's not going to happen. In the best case scenario, it's going to be like, and this is something that countries like Qatar are pushing for, to have some moderate elements, whatever that would mean, of Hamas in a more kind of, how to say, consensus government run by the Palestinian Authority or by technocrats, whatever. And so in that sense, in the best case scenario, Hamas and only some factions of Hamas, which are, by the way, not close to Iran, are going to be there. So because of that, the actual sort of, how to say, the context for Iran's support for Hamas is not going to be as it was before October 7. So as I mentioned before, Iran has already lost, I think, an important leg of its military approach against Israel. And also, if and this is also important, if the Arab efforts, especially Saudi efforts, and together with the international community, of course, like the United States, if that leads to the formation of a two-state solution, that would be another blow to Iran's ambitions. Because, make no mistake, Iran says it supports the Palestinian cause, but, it never really supports the two-state solution, an independent state for Palestinians. I mean, this is something that the Iranian foreign minister said publicly in Doha. He said, if there's one thing that we and the Israelis agree on, is basically our opposition to the two-state solution. Obviously, because it would reduce Iran's leverage over Palestinians. So that's how I see it. You're muted, right?
Sorry, you have some questions in chat box. Could you also take up? They are brief.
I mean, speaking of it, I'm to be honest, I'm not an expert on international law, and in terms of the procedure, etc. We have had like when it comes to the conflict in Gaza, we have had other cases of international law being ignored, like in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The thing is that when it comes to international relations, unfortunately, it's at the end of the day, it's military power and kind of strategic alliances that the state has that defines its room for maneuver, not necessarily international law. And the same can be said about the Syrian conflict. The same can be said about even the U.S. invasion of Iraq, especially, which was, or to Libya. So I, as someone who has more realist, I mean, in terms of conceptual orientation, I consider to be more realist than liberalist, and also with regard to the role of international law, I think this is a precedent that already has been there, and it's not a matter of the conflict in Gaza only. So the second one, does Iran face pressure to understand some of these conflicts similar to that? So I think I just answered that. The main and the most significant difference between the positions of Iran and Saudi Arabia is their approach to a state solution. Because for Saudi, I mean, this was part of Saudi Arabia's proposal, the Arab proposal for peace, like 20 years ago. That there must be to a state solution and an independent Palestinian state, etc., etc. And that's still the same. But for Iran, as I said, it's about basically, and to use it as a context to normalize relations with Israel. The only thing actually happened as a result of the war was that Saudi Arabia became more cautious in its stance, because they were already going ahead with normalization without a prospect for two-state solution. Now, because of the international and also kind of public opinion pressure in the Muslim world, they have kind of gone back to their initial plan. But Iran has been sort of consistent in its opposition to the two-state solution. And to be honest, because the whole idea of resistance, which is the foundation of Iran's regional strategy, is based on the existence of a conflict. And this is the irony. I would say Iran needs this conflict between Palestine and Israel, between Lebanon and Israel. Hezbollah needs the conflict with Israel in order to justify its very existence and its legitimacy. And that's the foundational difference in Iran's stance compared with that of Saudi Arabia. So level of dependency. So that's the thing. Hamas is not an Iranian proxy, and I briefly mentioned the decentralization in the axis of resistance. But even before that, actually Hamas was the loosest sort of ring in the chain of Iran's network of alliances, because only a decade ago, more than a decade, after the eruption of the war in Syria, we all remember that Hamas took a different stance, right? So Iran went full force in support of Bashar al-Assad, and Hezbollah also joined. The Iraqi groups later joined, but Hamas took side with, in line with its Muslim Brotherhood ideology. They took side with the opposition, and they publicly criticized Bashar al-Assad to the extent that they had to leave Damascus and leave their office basically in Damascus. And the relationship basically between Iran and Hamas was not good for a few years until 2018. And 2018 was when they accepted Assad again, and then the relationship with Iran also became kind of better. Hamas, as part of the Palestinian resistance, as they call it, has always been important to Iran. Iran provides this kind of comprehensive support, as I said, but it's not like, just look at the map. And, even in the case of Hezbollah, it's been increasingly difficult for Iran to, transfer all these shipments of arms to Hezbollah due to Israeli kind of activities. What they have done is to basically, there's been a shift in the pattern of their security assistance, Iranian security assistance. I co-authored an article about that in Mediterranean politics, actually. And that is based on transferring technology and also kind of spare parts. And the production, and it's usually very low cost. The production of most of these missiles, etc., these are all Iran-backed, Iranian technology, etc., but it's mostly local, with the participation and involvement, of course, of Iranian advisors and Iranian and IRGC members. So that's about also the military aspect. And finally, I mentioned briefly the ideological aspect. Hamas is very different than, especially Hezbollah, because Hezbollah believes in the ideology of so-called Vilayat al-Faqih and the supreme leadership of Khamenei. Just look at every single official meeting that Hassan Nasrallah has. He sits in a room where there's two pictures, Ayatollah Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei. So he considers himself as loyal to these guys. And the same is more or less the case with some of the Iraqi groups, but Hamas comes from a different background, from the Muslim Brotherhood. And so this is our ideology. And finally, when it comes to finance, a great deal of Hamas's financing has come from Qatar, with the knowledge and, of course, endorsement of international community and even Israel itself. In order to sustain a civil government in Gaza. They use it differently, that's for sure, but Iran is not the only supporter of Hamas. That's what I want to say. There's another question, I think. I wouldn't buy the arguments actually of diplomatic coup. China still has a very limited, not very limited maybe, but limited leverage in the region. That was the first move, of course, a breakthrough for China, but it was still. I think Chinese also have been quite clear-eyed about their actual capabilities, diplomatic capacity at the moment. So that's about that. But of course, it made one thing clear, and I have said this before, that even if the US wants to leave the Middle East, which I don't believe it has ever wanted, really, even if the US wants to leave the Middle East is not going to leave the United States alone. Because the whole vision of order in the region, in the sense that is that would preserve the American interest, is based on a sort of a regional setting in which Israel keeps the military edge over other countries, and then there's a balancing coalition or an overall balance of power system that would contain Iran and its allies in the region. Now it seems to be disrupting, and that was one of the reasons the United States was so quick to react and so strong to show to Iran. It has shown the limits of the US actual capabilities in the region. Of course, it doesn't mean that the United States doesn't cannot, for example, go to war in Yemen or whatever, but the consequences are quite clear, first, and second, priorities different than 20 years ago. So the main dilemma actually for the United States is how to preserve this order with as limited engagement as possible, like what they are doing with the Houthis, like what they limited, restrained, I would say, response to the killing of 3 American soldiers by Iraqi militias. So this is the dilemma, and Iran is still trying to push for the US to reduce its commitments in the region. But I think the overall situation has order because of this kind of provocations, and I would say counter provocations by different sides. And if there's not going to be, first, an immediate end to the war in Gaza, and second, some sort of diplomatic engagement, Iran is out of the United States, the situation in the region is going to be even more fragile. China is in no position to kind of stop the region from falling apart if it's going to fall apart.
Thank you very much. I think that we just had an excellent discussion, and I would agree with your realistic